The Stubborn Sheriff and His Feisty Bride.
Written by Etta Foster and published by Starfall Publications. Book from Historical Western Romance series. Save more with our ebook and audiobook bundles on our website starfallpublicationsbooks.com. Subscribe for more audiobooks. Enjoy.
Chapter 1. Pennsylvania, 1880. Naomi's heart beat a rapid thud against her chest. She tightly clutched her reticule even as her hands became clammy. She craned her neck yet again outside the window to see if a carriage was drawing up at the train station and the man she dreaded seeing would jump out of it, get into the train, and roughly pull her off it. Her heartbeat slowed a little when she didn't see any carriage but people waiting at the platform for the train to depart. She clasped her hands together, inwardly and earnestly praying to God to help her get out of her present predicament. Her eyes glazed with tears, but she rapidly blinked them away. This wasn't the time for tears. She had to remain strong, even though it seemed as if she was coming apart at the seams of her pale yellow gown, decorated with white lace. Her vibrant red hair was tied neatly at her nape with a white ribbon and covered with a white bonnet. Her face, though stiffened with worry, was exquisite. She saw some men glancing appreciatively at her face when they boarded, but she looked away. "All aboard," the trainmaster yelled at the top of his voice, and she almost rose from her seat with nervous energy, desperate for the train to pull away from the station. From her seat by the window, she watched as some of the other passengers who were still standing on the platform hurriedly hugged their loved ones and rushed into the train. The carriage became increasingly noisy, and the sound somewhat calmed her nerves, allowing her to not focus on her own desperate thoughts. The train puffed as its engines came alive, its piercing whistle making her want to whistle along, because if things went as planned, she was on her way to freedom. She cast one last look at the platform and sighed with relief as the train began its slow movement down the track. Her thoughts were on her father as the train continued its movement, taking her away from Pennsylvania and heading to Idaho. How disappointed he would be in her when he found out that she had snuck out of her small bedroom window and left their house. But what did he expect her to do? She couldn't marry William Branson, especially not now that Carl Saunders, in his last letter to her, had not only asked her to marry him, but had also sent enough money for her train ticket and her journey to his ranch. She couldn't possibly reject such a wonderful offer from Carl, and instead marry a man old enough to be her father, even though she had never set eyes on Carl. Her last thought made her wonder if she wasn't taking a huge risk by traveling thousands of miles to not only meet, but marry a total stranger. In all the time leading up to that moment, she hadn't thought what she was doing was dangerous because she had been very desperate. But now that she was actually going to meet Carl, she was beginning to have doubts. But what was I supposed to do? She asked under her breath. It was a hopeless situation, and she needed a quick way out of it. Being a mail-order bride to a sheriff in Idaho had seemed a good idea at the time, but now she wasn't so sure. She bit her bottom lip and looked out the window. "Hello, Missy." The old woman seated beside her drew her attention, and Naomi turned in her direction. "Hello, ma'am," she replied with a smile on her face. "What's a purty little thing like you're going to do in Idaho?" Naomi sighed. She wasn't really in the mood for conversation, but ignoring the woman's question would be rude, and her parents had not raised her to be a rude girl. "To meet my husband," she told the woman, who was looking at her keenly, and for a silly second, Naomi wondered if Will had sent her to spy on her. She inwardly shook her head. She was beginning to get paranoid, and it didn't help her situation. "How delightful," the woman exclaimed, and patted Naomi's hand with her wrinkled one. Naomi wondered what she would say if she told her that today was actually her wedding day to another man. That, in fact, the man was probably at the church now, waiting for his bride, his runaway bride. She wasn't sure Will would be able to live down the scandal, but it served him right. She had told him repeatedly that she couldn't marry him, but he had insisted simply because he had a hold on her father. "Papa." Her thoughts went to the man whose shoulders she had leaned on ever since her mother died. Tears wet her eyes at how hurt he would be by her arguably selfish act. She had always been an obedient child, trusting that her father knew what was best for her, but not in this case. Her happiness was what mattered, and she knew that it didn't lie in the hands of Will. The troubled girl leaned back in her seat and closed her eyes. This was a journey she had always yearned for, so she would put all her worries aside and enjoy it. She had never been outside Pennsylvania in all her life. This was one experience she would cherish for the rest of her days, even though it would be a draining one. The journey took 5 days, and though it was tiresome, she enjoyed every bit of it. She was too anxious to sleep soundly like the other passengers. Her gaze was always glued to the window to take in the flat plains, rocky creeks, mountains, meadows, and sage-covered slopes in turn. Every mile the train ate up brought her closer to Carl, and she couldn't wait to meet him. At last! Naomi breathed with a sigh of relief as the train finally pulled up to a station, and from the rough-hewn signboard, she saw they had reached her destination. "Welcome to Silver Creek Valley." She swiftly rose, stretched her stiff limbs, and helped the old woman off the train. Naomi moved along the platform, which was teeming with people, and located her trunk. After bidding farewell to the old woman and her family, she sat on her trunk, twirling her reticule in her hands. She became nervous when she realized she had no idea what Carl looked like. Thoughts of his appearance had crossed her mind a couple of times, but she usually pushed them away because a person's looks didn't matter to her the way their heart and character did. Carl, she had deduced from his letters, seemed to be of good character, but now she was beginning to think it was foolish of her not to have asked. Abruptly, she rose from her trunk and tried to look as if she had her wits about her. Her chin thrust forward, and she tried to appear taller than her average height. As usual, she saw men staring at her, but she avoided their eyes. It seemed men in the West were no different from Pennsylvania. Her eyes darted all over the platform, and her heart slammed painfully in her chest when she saw a man with a warm smile on his face slowly walking towards her. His appearance surprised her because he looked more like a rancher than a sheriff with his buckskins, leather boots, and black straw hat. What was she thinking? He lived on a ranch, so of course he would look like a rancher. The tall man kept strolling forward with an easy pace, and Naomi took the time to study his features. He was quite handsome, with thick, dark brown hair, bushy brown eyebrows, and eyes she could see were also brown as he drew closer. A broad nose, beautifully shaped lips, and a strong chin that was cleanly shaven rounded off his facial features. His ruggedly handsome visage didn't bring the thrill inside her that she had hoped for upon first seeing him, and she felt a pang of disappointment. She had thought that seeing him would be like having all her dreams come true, but now she didn't feel an ounce of attraction towards him. "Oh, fudge, what do I do now?" she said under her breath as the man covered the distance between them. Her mouth twitched with nervousness. "Miss Naomi Hart?" he asked in a very youthful and playful voice, his smile still plastered on his handsome face. Naomi nodded, swallowed thickly, and said, "Yes. Are you Carl Saunders?" Her head cocked slightly. He shook his head, still smiling, and avoided her eyes before saying, "I'm Winston, Carl's brother." "Oh, nice to meet you," she squeaked, and her face flushed. She had totally forgotten about the younger brother Carl had told her about. How silly of her. As he carried her trunk and led the way to his wagon, her brows creased as she tried to remember what Carl had written about his brother. He was a rancher and was 2 years younger than him. She tried to remember more, but nothing came to her. When they reached the wagon and he placed her trunk in it, she couldn't stop herself from asking the question foremost in her mind. Where's Carl? It was only proper for him to have been the one to come for her. A nervous look crossed Winston's features. He had to go in pursuit of some cattle rustlers. He'll be home later. Naomi's brows arched at his unease, and she wondered why. Was it fear of his big brother? No, that didn't seem likely, not from what she had come to know about Carl. It was most likely Winston wasn't used to women. He helped her climb on the wagon and then did the same. "Get! Ha!" Winston shouted at the horses and whipped them into moving. Naomi admired the way he handled them. Her eyes moved from the horses to her surroundings. As they journeyed on, the town opened up, and she saw and took in its dusty roads and a cluster of buildings comprising saloons, a hotel, a newspaper vendor, a dressmaking shop, and a bakery. There were men moving about with cowboy hats and boots on, while women dressed in what they believed was the latest fashion. She tied her bonnet securely under her chin as a gust of wind blew. She couldn't suppress the thrill of excitement that went through her. Naomi couldn't believe she was here and ready to meet her future husband. They continued out of town, following a trail into the countryside with its low gray hills, tall grasses, and sages. She opened her mouth to start a conversation with Winston, feeling uncomfortable as the silence between them lengthened. But she couldn't think of anything to say, so she decided to keep mute. Winston was probably a man of few words, so she didn't want to make him uncomfortable by being a talker. The horses finally turned onto a trail, and she could see the ranch in the distance. The sight took her breath away. It covered impressive acres of land, with willows skirting the property to the south, barns and horse corrals to the west, and wide grassland where she could see some of the ranch animals grazing, and a picturesque creek. The horses came to a stop in front of the ranch house, a white stone building with white pillared porches. Winston jumped down and helped her to descend, as her gaze roamed all over the property. Her gaze fell on the distant mountains against the backdrop of the beautiful sky. Her eyes squinted at the far distance. She longed to take a walk along the grove of trees and have a picnic at the creek. "This way, ma'am." Winston stretched his arm towards the wooden front door after hefting her trunk off the wagon. Naomi stared at the large and simply furnished living room before Winston led her into a small room that had a single bed and a small chest of drawers. He placed her trunk beside the drawers. "You can rest a little before dinner. There's a pitcher of water by the bed and a basin for you to clean up. I'll tell you as soon as dinner is ready." He left the room, shutting the door behind him quietly. Untying her bonnet, she opened her trunk, removed the pins from her hair, took out a brush, and combed the lush tresses before replacing the pins and the bonnet. She poured water into the basin and washed her hands and her face in it. After doing that, she felt better and decided she was ready to face Carl. A small knock sounded on the door, and she heard Winston's voice telling her dinner was ready. She opened the door, returned his smile, and followed him to the kitchen and the smell of delicious cooking. On the large table was a bowl of venison stew, cornbread, fresh butter, and crockery. Her stomach growled from hunger, and she couldn't wait to devour the tasty-looking meal, even though she wasn't much of an eater. She hadn't had a decent meal since leaving Pennsylvania. "Carl will be home in a few minutes," he informed her, as if understanding the question in her eyes as he pulled out a chair for her. Naomi smiled her thanks to him and was about to sit when she heard the front door open and close, and her heart started beating frantically. Heavy feet trudged the wooden floor in the direction of the kitchen, and a tall man cast a handsome silhouette at the door. He bent his head and came into the room, removing his green hat that matched his green uniform with an air of authority that left no one in doubt of who he was. He wore a pistol in a holster around his right hip. Carl Saunders. Her lower lip parted company from the upper. She hadn't expected him to be this handsome. His blue eyes met her brown ones as they stared at each other, and the atmosphere became charged. Naomi couldn't understand the emotions churning inside her as she gawked at the tall, alluring figure. His dark and wavy hair was creased at the point where his hat had rested. His face was deeply tanned and rugged, and there were tired lines at the corners of his eyes. She deduced that he was a man who worked very hard and had very little time for leisure. From his forehead, she scanned downwards, taking in dark, intense eyes, a broad and slightly pointed nose, lips that had her blushing furiously, and a strong chin that was devoid of any stubble. She had never seen a more handsome man. Faint warmth crept up her cheeks when she realized that she was gaping at him. Her eyes quickly lowered. She wasn't surprised at the thrill that went from her toes to the roots of her hair. She was pleased he was to be her husband, if he accepted her. She lifted her eyes for another peek at him and saw he was still staring at her with something close to awe. His scrutiny made her slightly uncomfortable, but she too had also been staring, so she couldn't really blame him. This was their first sighting of each other. "I didn't know you had a visitor, Winston." He spoke to his brother in deep tones that fit his features after some moments had passed. "Who is she?" Chapter 2. The silence that descended in the room was so thick, a knife would do just fine cutting it. Naomi's involuntary gasp drew Carl's intense gaze on her again. There was nothing she could do to hide the surprise in her eyes. Who was she? Was this some sort of joke? Were they trying to cut a shine on her? She had his letters in her trunk as proof. Her eyes moved from Carl to Winston, who was still standing by the stove. His features reflected despair for a few seconds before he sighed and came forward. "She's your mail-order bride," he shortly replied with unease in his voice. "My what?" Carl's voice was so thunderous, Naomi jerked in discomfiture. Winston's face became pinched as he ran his hand through his tousled hair. "I was going to tell you, but—" He trailed off and gripped the chair before him, avoiding his brother's gaze of fury. The sheriff also ran a hand through his dark tresses, and his eyes blazed in anger. "Tell me what?" Winston raised his hand to say something, but dropped it, turning pleading eyes on Naomi. "Naomi, I'm so sorry. I have a confession to make." Naomi's heart thumped loudly against her rib cage, and with foresight, she knew she wasn't going to like his confession. Her mouth became dry, and a tremor went up her body. The obviously distraught man stared at his hands on the chair for a moment before lifting his eyes to make his confession. "I wrote all those letters to you, not Carl." Naomi's forehead was suddenly soaked with sweat, and her legs wobbled under her. She decided to sit before she could make an utter fool of herself, more than Winston had already made of her. Crumpling on the ground and weeping her eyes out would be disastrous, so she quickly pulled out a chair and sat. Her head bowed, and she tried to still the shivers racking her slim body. Carl, still standing by the door, let out a curse word and took some steps forward with fisted hands. "What have you done, Winston?" he asked in savage anger. His brother's shaky hand went through his hair again, something he did when he was very nervous. "I did it for you, Carl. Whether you agree with me or not, you need a woman in your life." The sheriff's hand slammed against the wooden table, making not only the crockery, but Naomi jump too. However, she hurriedly lowered her gaze when she saw the intense fury in the sheriff's eyes. "Don't take that tone with me, young man. I told you I'd find my own woman. I don't need you to do that for me. I've told you 100 times to stop meddling in my affairs. It's not your call to make. You can't continue living like this, Carl. You've got to lay Grace's ghost to rest. It's been 3 years. That's none of your business. If I want to mourn her for the rest of my life, then so be it," he retorted hotly. His face tightened in a massive frown. "It wasn't enough that you meddled in my life. Now you've roped an innocent lady into it." His clipped words made his brother's face lose color. Naomi's head remained bent as the two brothers exchanged blistering words. Her thoughts drifted from the accusations flung across the room as the two brothers aired their dirty linens, totally forgetting her. Did this mean she had come all the way from Pennsylvania for nothing? Her spirit sank to her toes. It had really seemed too good to be true at first. But hope and the need for a solution to her problem had pushed her. Sudden anger displaced the feeling of self-pity which had held her bound for some minutes. Rage coursed all over her body and made her face flush. If only Winston had told her he was writing on behalf of his brother, she would have understood. But the question was, would she have agreed to come, knowing she wasn't wanted by the man? She didn't know the answer to that. All she knew now was that her spirit was crushed and that her journey was all for naught. She had very little money left after going to have dresses made, so she wouldn't look like a beggar before her future husband. The thought of going back home didn't appeal to her one bit. Anger kept her silent because she couldn't understand why Winston had deceived her in such a manner. Now she felt foolish, and the thought of Carl seeing her as a desperate woman filled her with shame. She felt like cussing Winston for treating her in such an insensitive manner, but, brought up as a gently bred lady, the words wouldn't pass her throat. As she heard the genuine concern for his brother in Winston's voice, she began to understand why he had done what he had, but she was still angry because now it seemed that she had to go back home and marry Will. Winston had obviously done it out of love for Carl, but his methods weren't appealing one bit. It seemed Carl wasn't in any way ready to get married, probably because of this Grace. All her daydreaming of a loving husband was all for naught, and all those sweet words were from a man she felt absolutely nothing for. Silence finally enveloped the room when Carl stormed out of the place in anger and slammed the front door. Winston pulled out a chair close to her and sat down in a weary manner. A large groan rumbled from his throat. His words were soft and rueful when he finally spoke. Naomi, I don't expect you to understand why I did this, but I'm truly sorry. I didn't mean to botch things up. Naomi suddenly felt pity for him. His features were strained and his lips formed a thin line. I wanted to tell you I was writing on behalf of Carl, but I was scared you wouldn't come, and I needed desperately for you to come because after exchanging letters with you, I knew within me that you were the perfect woman for him, but... She forced a weak smile on her face. It's okay, Winston. I perfectly understand. His eyes held surprise. You do? She shrugged and admitted ruefully. I'm just disappointed that I came out here for nothing, though it was quite an adventure. I'll have to go back. The young man vigorously shook his head and placed his hand on hers on the table before quickly jerking it away. I'm sorry, you can't go back. Why? I saw the way Carl looked at you before he found out who you were. He couldn't take his eyes off you. He likes you. He's just angry at my methods. But believe me, once he gets to know you, you'll be married before you know it. Just give it time. The young woman was elated at the words, but she couldn't rest her hope on that. Perhaps Winston was just saying it to placate her. She shook her head. I can't base my future plans on mere speculations. His countenance became earnest. Please, you must stay. You have to. I know my brother. He'll come around. Stay for a few days, a week, 2 weeks, maybe a month. I've employed a maid for you to be your chaperone. She's in one of the bunkhouses. I'll fetch her immediately. A smile curled Naomi's lips at the man's antics. He obviously felt if she stayed long enough, his brother would fall in love with her. She wanted to believe that, but she had to be practical. However, she really didn't want to go back home just yet, and besides, she didn't have enough money to do that. She surmised that she would have to find work. Perhaps she could work in the bakery she had seen or in any of the mercantile shops in town. All right, Winston, I'll stay, but only for a short while. Maybe by the time she went back home, she would have earned enough money to pay Will off. A big grin spread across Winston's handsome face. Thank you. You won't regret it. That's left to be seen, Naomi thought. But that night, when she lay on her bed and sleep was far from coming, she had to admit to herself that there was something about Carl that drew her to him. She wanted to know everything about him, and she really hoped from the bottom of her heart that he would come to like her and they would get married. Oh, fudge. How did I get myself into this predicament in the first place? She asked, no one in particular, turning on the bed to stare at the maid who was lying on her bedroll on the floor, deep in sleep. As she closed her eyes and tried to let the soft hands of sleep carry her away, she remembered the conversation with her father that had started the chain of events which had led to that very moment. Chapter 3. 7 months earlier, Pennsylvania. It was a month after Ruth Hart's burial, but her daughter still felt her loss like it was yesterday. Ruth, succumbing to the mysterious ailment that had plagued her for months, was a heavy blow to her husband and her daughter. "Oh, Mama, I miss you so much," Naomi said in a voice filled with tears that matched her eyes as she plucked a weed from the ground. She sat back on her haunches and stared at her gloved hand. She recalled with intense sadness the period before her mother's demise. The young girl had tried her best to nurse the woman back to health, and her father had taken her to see different doctors, buying all the medicine recommended by them. Alas, one told them that the disease had eaten deep into her body, and there was nothing that could be done about it. Why did her mother have to die? Why did that wicked illness snatch her away from them? She remembered the first time Mama fainted in front of her when she was climbing the stairs to change for dinner. That had been the beginning of her mother's journey into ill health. Within a month, the woman lost so much weight, she became like a scarecrow. Her pallor was so pale she looked deathly white, which was a cause of constant worry to her family. Every treatment the doctors had tried hadn't worked, but that hadn't stopped her father from trying to find a cure. Ruth had begged her husband to stop, admitting that she had made peace with dying, but Benjamin wouldn't listen. "I love you," he rasped, in a voice filled with despair. "I can't watch you waste away and not do anything about it." Her mother managed to raise a thin hand and cupped her husband's chin, staring into his eyes, which were filled with strain at the corners. She smiled weakly at him. "Oh, Ben, my love, it hurts that I have to leave like this, but you've got to accept it. There's nothing anyone can do about it." A sob caught in Benjamin's throat as he gently clasped her hand. Her mother had continued, "You have to be brave and move on for Naomi's sake. I know you will take very good care of her. When the time for mourning passes, you must try to find love again." Benjamin shook his head vehemently. "Never." She shook her head. "You mustn't say that. You will find love again. I don't want you to be alone. You will need a wife and Naomi, a mother." Naomi had sat in her usual position beside the bed, not saying a word as tears chased each other down her face. "There you are." Her father's voice jolted her out of her reverie. She swiftly wiped away her tears with her apron and forced a smile on her face. "Papa," her voice came out as a croak and she cleared her throat. "Are you all right?" he asked when he reached her. She pushed herself to her feet, schooled her features, hoping her eyes weren't still wet, and blinked them just to make sure. She let out a deep breath before she turned to look at the man who had worry in his eyes. Naomi could see that her father was still reeling from the death of her mother. He looked far older than his 56 years of age. Gray had replaced his once dark tresses, and they thinned out also. Spider webs made their mark at the edges of his eyes, and the bags underneath them were a testament to his many sleepless nights. Pity for him flowed through her body, and despite her resolve not to show her grief, tears wet her eyes. "I'm fine, Papa. I was just remembering how Mama and I used to work here together." A distant look crossed her father's face, and a fond smile formed at his lips before he nodded. "You two used to have a wonderful time here together and completely forget about me inside the house." Laughter burst forth from her as she recalled a memory of her father standing with arms akimbo, giving her and her mother a stern look at the garden gate. He had been home for hours, but the members of his small family had decided to spend the whole day in the garden, taking breaks to drink tea and chat under the shade of the orange tree at the back of the house. She remembered she and her mother bursting into fits of giggles at the sight of him. "I miss her." He shook his head as if shaking off a memory, and his countenance became solemn. "I need to speak with you in my study." The change in his features alarmed her a little, but she nodded. "I'll quickly wash up and join you." He nodded and departed from her presence, leaving her to wonder what he wanted to talk about that made him seem so somber. She undid her apron and quickly cleaned up before entering the house through the side door, tying her red hair, which she had gotten from her mother, in a bun. She let out her breath and knocked softly on the door of the study. "Come in, Naomi," her father summoned, and she went in. Her father was seated behind his worn table with his hands folded on it. The way he unfolded them and laid them flat on the table before folding them again confirmed her suspicions that something was wrong. A small frown creased her face. "Papa, are you all right?" He avoided her eyes when he said, "I'm fine. Take a seat." Feeling a little apprehensive at the uneasy look on his face, she pulled out a chair and quietly sat. "Papa, is something wrong?" He offered her a false smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Everything is fine, Naomi. I have something important to tell you. But first, I want you to know I'm very proud of you." A warm smile crossed her face, and she played with the hem of her gray calico dress. She hadn't expected him to say that when she had been so apprehensive that he was about to tell her that he had been diagnosed with a deadly ailment. "You've grown up to be a beautiful lady. You look exactly like your mother did when she was also 19 years old. She was so beautiful, I couldn't take my eyes off her." His eyes took on a dreamy expression, and she knew he was missing her mother terribly. He went on and on about the first time he had seen Ruth at the park when he took a ride there, and he had fallen in love with her instantly. As he talked about the adventure he had, before he eventually married the love of his life, his daughter wished she would someday find the kind of love her parents had shared. "And that brings me to what I have to tell you," her father said, and she came back from her thoughts to notice the uneasiness in him again. "Naomi, I would love to see you settled in marriage before anything happens to me." Alarm crept into her eyes. "Oh, Papa, please don't talk like that." He let out a sigh and sat back in his chair. "We didn't expect your mother would leave us so soon." She nodded. He was right, but she wasn't ready to leave him just yet. She had just lost a parent. She didn't want to lose another. Not that she was going to lose him, but she wasn't ready to leave home yet. Besides, she hadn't yet seen any man she wanted to marry. She got a lot of stares and attention whenever she went out, but having spent the past 6 months indoors, nursing her sick mother, she didn't even know what was going on in society anymore. Her best friend Agnes tried her best to fill her in on the details, but concern for her mother made her deaf to them. "I know, Papa. I also understand that you are concerned about my future, but I assure you that everything will be fine. I really am not ready to get married at the moment." Her father rose from his chair and began pacing the room, which unnerved his daughter. "I'm sorry, but you don't have a choice in the matter anymore." A gasp escaped her throat as she shifted uneasily in her chair with frantic eyes. "What do you mean?" The man stopped pacing, stood behind his chair, and settled sad eyes on his daughter. "You're to marry William Branson as soon as the appropriate period of mourning your mother is over," he pronounced with solemnity. His daughter's first reaction to the news was shock so great it robbed her of words. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water, and she didn't even know when she pushed herself to her feet. William Branson. Who was he, and why did she have to marry him? She opened her mouth to ask the question, but nothing came out but a squeak. She closed it, swallowed thickly, licked her rosebud lips that had suddenly gone dry, and tried again. "Why do I have to marry this man that I know absolutely nothing about?" He sighed and raked a shaky hand through his hair. "Sit, Naomi." She did as he instructed in a stiff manner, her tongue wetting her lips in an act of nervousness. Her heart dropped when her father told her the pathetic story of having become bankrupt when his merchant business went under, having removed funds to treat her mother but not returning them. Then someone introduced him to the loan shark, Will, and he had borrowed a huge sum of money from him, hoping he would be able to pay it back once Ruth became well, and he focused his attention on his business again. However, It wasn't to be so. You and I have no choice in the matter, my dear.
Before we continue into the story, do us a favor. Like this video and hit the subscribe button because it helps very much with YouTube's algorithm. If you want the audiobooks ads free, visit our website and select our bundles to save more. Thank you again. Now back to our story.
I've thought of a number of ways to get out of it, and even offered to go to debtor's prison just to get you out of marrying him, but he refused, insisting that it was either marriage to you or the entire loan back, not even in installments. Chapter 4. No, no, Naomi muttered as she thrashed around on her bed. She felt a hand shaking her, and she jolted awake and instantly sat up, blinking at the worried maid. The maid straightened and stared down at her in discomfiture. "I'm sorry for waking you up, missy, but you'll be talking in your sleep and I don't know what to do." "It's okay, Anna," Naomi quickly replied to calm the maid's nerves. She lay back on the bed and drew up the sheets she had pushed to the bottom of the bed in her restless sleep. She had drifted off to sleep, thinking of that horrific day her father told her that terrible news, and somehow she had relived it in her dream. Her mind went back to that day and she shuddered involuntarily. She recalled arguing with her father about why she couldn't marry the loan shark, but her grief-stricken father had insisted that they both had no say in the matter. Exasperated, she had told him to go to another loan shark to get the money to pay off Will while they found a way to pay back the new loan shark. Her father had told her that he had tried doing that, but he had already gotten a bad reputation for not paying back Will's loan, and the angry loan shark had found a way to get no one to help him. Frustrated, she had suggested, "What about the bank? You were a very good customer to them." Her father shook his head in defeat before telling her that he had also borrowed heavily from the bank in a bid to try to save his business when it started going downhill. So he couldn't meet them for any more money. Then he told her the other bad news. The bank was coming for the house as a means of paying his debt. So in a few weeks, they would have to move to a much smaller house. He added that it was the reason he thought marrying Will was going to be a good idea. The man was wealthy, and she would have a roof over her head, even better than the one they were presently living in. That hadn't placated her at all, and weeping, something she didn't do often, she ran out of the study, up to her room, and lay on her bed wishing she could die like her mother. Her attention came back to her present surroundings, and the chirping of birds beside her window was a welcome sound. She flung aside the sheets to rise from her bed and go to the window to look at them. When she noticed that Anna was still standing by the bed, staring at her with expectation in her eyes. "Begging your pardon, missy, but Master Carl be wanting to talk to yer." Naomi had to inwardly tell her heart to stop beating so fast, as her mind thought of a number of reasons why he wanted to see her. Had he calmed down and realized it wasn't a bad idea after all for his brother to have ordered a bride for him? A glimmer of hope made her eyes brighten, and she lifted them to the maid, who was waiting for a reply and regarding her with interest. For a short moment, Naomi wondered what the young girl was thinking. Was she thinking she was a very desperate lady for what she had done? Naomi shrugged nonchalantly. She didn't care what the maid thought of her. Anna didn't know anything about her and what she had been through in life, so she was entitled to her own opinions. "Thank you for the message, Anna. Please tell him I'll be with him shortly." Anna nodded and said, "Yer be needin' help with dressin'?" Naomi shook her head and rose from the bed. The maid departed from the room. As she washed and got dressed in a simple but beautiful print dress that made her look elegant. Her mind drifted back and forth on the reason Carl wanted to see her. After staring at herself in the small mirror hung on the wall, she felt she was ready to face him. Carefully opening the door, she stepped out of the room into the narrow hallway before she took slow steps towards the living room. "In here, Miss Hart." She heard a voice from the kitchen that sent thrills all over her body. "Oh, fudge," she muttered under her breath. Was this how she would react to him any time he spoke to her? Pulling herself together, she slowly found her way into the kitchen, and it hit her once again how tall and handsome the man standing beside the stove with a cup in his large hand was. His hair was wet, and it was all she could do not to run her hands through the luxuriant mane. She noticed he wore his sheriff uniform from the night before. His heated gaze on her halted her steps, and she stood transfixed as his eyes trailed her from her slippers to her hair tied in a bun on her head. Thrilled by an electric buzz in the air, she found it hard to breathe for some seconds. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the moment passed and everything returned to normal and she could breathe again. "Good morning, Miss Hart. I trust you slept well." Naomi lowered her eyes to avoid him seeing the disappointment there. He sounded so formal he might as well be talking to one of his cattle. She giggled inwardly at the thought of Carl talking to an animal. "Very well, Mr. Saunders. Good morning. Did you have a good night?" She returned as coldly as she could muster. Well, if he wanted to treat her like a stranger, she would too. He probably got the message because his brows arched. "As good as could be expected given the situation we found ourselves in." "Oh," was all she said, allowing her gaze to trail the small but clean and neatly kept place. "Allow me to pour you a cup of coffee," he offered, but she raised a hand and shook her head. She needed to hear what he had to say first. Besides, her stomach was in such a knot at his presence. She would probably throw up anything that passed her throat. "You wish to speak with me." A frown creased his forehead, and he took a sip from his coffee before nodding his head. He jerked his head towards a chair by the large table that took up considerable space in the kitchen. How ungentlemanly of him not to pull out a chair when Winston did it the evening before. At the thought of his brother, she wondered where the easygoing man was. She wished Winston was the brother she was drawn to and supposed to marry instead of this dark and brooding man. "Aren't you going to sit?" she questioned, when she noticed he hadn't shifted from his position by the stove. He shook his head. She surprised him by rising to her feet. "Then I feel I'm at a disadvantage with you staring down at me." He blinked, unable to say a word at first, and that made Naomi smile inwardly. Let him know she wasn't a pushover. "I was only trying to treat you like a lady." She stifled an angry retort and then threw at him. "Well, then, you should have begun by pulling out a chair for me." He looked as if he would rather be anywhere else than in the kitchen with her arguing about sitting arrangements. "My apologies." He strode forward and pulled out another chair for her. With a wry smile on her face, she thanked him and sat down. "Happy now?" She offered him a bright smile. Ecstatic. "I'll get straight to the point," he informed her briskly. He placed his cup on the table, folded his hands across his chest, and put one ankle across the other. "I apologize on behalf of my brother for dragging you all the way from Pennsylvania to this place. It was very irresponsible of him, and I'm wholly disappointed in him. That said, I know nothing can ever replace the time you wasted coming here. But I hope a ticket back home and some money to cover the cost of the journey would placate you." The train will be going back to the north in 2 days, so you can spend the time exploring and enjoying Silver Creek Valley." Red color suffused her face as she felt as if she had been slapped. He hadn't lifted his hand, but his words had done the job for him. So the plan was to send her back home and keep her sweet and placated with money? Wasn't it better if she had married Will than come all the way here to receive such an insult? Rage overcame her when she noted the smug look on Carl's face. She rose fluidly to her feet, not caring whether it was graceful or not, and looked him squarely in the face as her height would allow her, before flatly announcing her refusal. "No." He did a double take. "Excuse me?" Her face tightened. "I said no. I didn't come out here for your dirty money. I came here to get married, and I will. So you're not going to send me back home like a good little girl who doesn't have a mind of her own." Carl's face became as hard as one of the mountains overlooking the ranch. He changed his slouching position, and Naomi had to tilt her head back a little as he straightened to his full height. She was clearly at a disadvantage as he towered over her like a huge tree, but she stood her ground, ignoring the anger that darkened his eyes. "You will leave this ranch," he firmly declared, and she flinched at the words. A wicked smile curled his lips. "In fact, you won't stay a minute more in this house. Go and get your things. I'm taking you to town. You will stay at the Silver Creek Hotel until the train comes." Another woman would have cowered before him, but not Naomi. She wasn't a redhead for nothing, and even though she didn't lose her temper often, when she did, it wasn't a pretty sight. "I'm going nowhere, you arrogant lout," she yelled at him, making him draw back a little in shock. With her eyes blazing and her face red with anger, she continued, "You ought to be grateful that such a wonderful brother like Winston was willing to do something so sweet for you so you wouldn't be alone for the rest of your miserable life." Fury blazed in Carl's eyes, and his face became menacing, causing a frightened gasp to escape Naomi's lips. But she was just too angry to back down. With fisted hands, he snarled, "Well, if you're his definition of sweet, I'd rather die of bitterness. Why, what made you travel all those miles to come and marry a total stranger? None of the men back home would have you because you're too prickly a pear to come close to." Her nose flared at his sneer, and she stamped a foot on the floor. Better a prickly pear than an arrogant swine. "Now look here." She raised a finger at him. "No, you look here. You won't get rid of me as easily as you think If you think I'm gonna marry you, then you must be crazier than I thought. I wouldn't marry you even if I were paid." He let out a humorless laugh. "Ha, I wouldn't marry you if you were given to me as a gift." They both jerked in the direction of Winston's voice as he came into the kitchen. "What's going on here?" Chapter 5. "Somebody is in a mighty fine mood this morning," Ray Sullivan, Carl's deputy, teased. As Carl stalked into the office, they shared with his face like that of a brewing storm. The sheriff ignored him and threw his hat on his table before throwing himself on the chair beside it and swinging his legs onto the bare table to cross them at the heels. Ray Sullivan, with a wide grin on his face, got up from his chair and covered the distance between them to perch a hip on his boss's table. He took a swig from his cup of coffee. "What has your horses in a rattle this morning?" he questioned, but got no response from the irate man. "Want me to pour you a cup of coffee to calm your frayed nerves?" he suggested, still with that grin on his face. When Carl still didn't say anything but stared fixatedly at the table, Ray went to pour the coffee anyway. He handed the cup to his friend, knowing he would tell him what had his cage rattled when he was good and ready. About 20 minutes passed before Carl opened his mouth, still in disbelief, and announced, "Winston got me a mail-order bride." Coffee splattered from the deputy's mouth, and he gave Carl a sharp look. "No kidding." "The meddling boy did. The most annoying thing is that he got me a crazy woman." Ray threw back his head, and hilarious laughter bubbled from his chest out of his throat. Carl eyed him angrily, but the brown-haired man continued laughing. Trying to contain his laugh after a few minutes elapsed, he said, "Things ought to be pretty interesting around here." Carl threw him a dark look, but he continued laughing. "You should invite me over for dinner tonight. I want to meet the crazy woman." Carl ignored him and was happy when someone called for Ray's attention and he had to leave the office. He swung his legs to the floor, trying to understand if he had imagined the heated exchange in the kitchen or whether it had really happened. He who took women as feather-brained beings had stooped so low as to exchange words with a crazy one. What was it about her that made him act out of character? Her beauty, a tiny voice said in his mind, and he quickly pushed it away. He had seen beautiful women before. Heck, even Grace had been quite a beauty. "Not that kind of beauty," the voice said again. "Shut up," he snapped and got up to start pacing the room. Yes, she had a beauty he had never quite seen before, he had to admit, even in his anger. A beauty so exquisite all he wanted to do was stare at her all day. From the glorious red mane on her head to her small feet that just begged to be massaged. Her face was so angelic that hearing her yell at him had come as a huge shock because he didn't believe anything so beautiful would have such a vile tongue. In his mind's eye, he pictured her as he had first seen her in the kitchen the previous night. A heart-shaped face, beautiful gray eyes, perfectly sculptured cheekbones, a lush mouth that made him wonder how she would taste if he placed his lips on them. He could bet it would be like peaches, not to mention her skin that was as pale as milk. Lord, she was beautiful, but unfortunately also crazy. Well, maybe not crazy, but very feisty, and he didn't like his women that way. He liked them quiet and well-mannered, just as his Grace had been, not one who didn't mind shooting off her mouth. He was sorely tempted to keep her around just so he could tame her, but the drama would be too much for him. She would eventually drive him crazy. Just a few minutes in her presence, and he had nearly lost it. Thank goodness Winston had come in when he did. Without saying a single word, he had stormed out of the place. No, he shook his head. If he allowed the attraction he felt towards her to grow, she would be the death of him. He had seen firsthand how she would be if he had a contrary opinion to hers. She would scream the house down and most likely destroy his stuff just to get her point across. He was tempted, but not that tempted. Besides, he had Winston to think about. What kind of influence would she be on his even-tempered brother? She would chew him and spit him out, and Winston would still be smiling like a ninny. What possessed Winston into inviting such a woman over? He questioned no one in particular as he continued pacing. He sighed when he recalled the first time his brother had broached the topic with him. He had decided that morning that since there wasn't much work to be done in the office, and Ray could always contact him in case of any emergency, he would stay back to help Winston with ranch work. He was concentrating on cleaning out the stalls after fixing the harnesses when Winston started talking as he brought in fresh hay for the horses. "Do you know I listened to a very interesting conversation in town the other day?" Carl rolled his eyes. Winston always started his conversations this way when he had an outrageous suggestion up his sleeve. No, he simply said, and made the single word as flat as possible. Undisturbed by his non-committal reply, Winston continued. They were talking about a mail-order bride. What's a mail-order bride? He questioned just to indulge him. Winston laughed, and surely even he knew it sounded fake. You know we're not blessed with a lot of women in these parts, so some men found a way to get women over here. They would place adverts in the Matrimonial Times, specifying the kind of women they wanted. They would get replies from women all over the country, and they would make their pick. The women would come over, and if things worked out between them, they would get married and live happily ever after. Carl scoffed. What a foolish idea. Why would any woman want to come out here except if she was running from the law or trying to hide from a scandal? Well, that's not always the case. Some women are lonely, some just want an adventure, and some might not have had any offers of marriage from anyone, and so would decide to take a chance and come over to the West. Sounds very stupid to me. No, it isn't, not at all. The man who I listen to already has one, and she's pregnant and everything he hoped for in a woman. Well, it's still not a good idea to me. You can't just marry a woman you know nothing about. True, but they don't just invite the woman over and then marry her immediately. They take time to get to know her. If there are females in their house, she stays there while they get to know each other. But if there aren't any, a chaperone is hired for the sake of propriety. Carl scoffed again and kept silent, hoping that Winston would get the message, but of course he didn't. You know what? His brother grimaced. No, I don't. As the man was talking, an idea came to my mind. And do you know who would be perfect to get a mail-order bride? Carl shook his head, already knowing where his brother was heading with the annoying conversation. He rolled his eyes. Oh, pray tell, who is this person? He questioned dramatically. You, Winston grinned. Carl paused in the act of shoveling manure and simply said, no. Come on, Carl, it's a perfect idea. You will have a woman to not only be a companion to you, but to also bear you beautiful children and be a homemaker. Carl placed his hand at the top of the shovel and pretended to think about it. Again, no. Winston drew closer. You know you need a woman. You're lonely. Ever since Grace died, you haven't been yourself, and I hate to see you like this. You need to come out of your shell and start living life again. Carl said sharply, with a note of impatience in his voice. Winston, let it go. I'm satisfied with my life the way it is. If I need a woman, I know where to get one. This topic is closed. But... I mean it, Winston, Carl warned sternly. This topic is closed forever. Stop meddling in my life for God's sake. And if you're so interested in the mail order thing, why don't you order one for yourself? There's nowhere written that you can't get married even if I'm not. He threw sarcastically at his brother and continued his work, completely ignoring the man who stood transfixed there. If he had lifted his eyes, he would have seen that that was the very moment the idea of getting him a bride was birthed in Winston's mischievous mind. Carl had to admit that even though he had found the idea outrageous, that night when he lay on his bed staring at the ceiling, the thought had crossed his mind again, and he had toyed with the idea of going ahead with it. He really did need a woman if he was being truthful with himself. In fact, the whole ranch needed a woman. The house needed the touch of a woman, and not just that of their old housekeeper who came in weekly to clean, wash, and keep the place tidy. Besides, he wanted children too, but was it wise going for a total stranger? There were bound to be lies from the woman because he couldn't see a lady traveling miles to marry a stranger. No, he shook his head. Things were best this way. One day he would meet a woman, maybe not love her the way he had loved Grace, but she would give him all he needed. He came back to the present when Ray returned to the office and whistled. "Would you look at that?" he said in awe, with his gaze focused on the window. Carl ignored him, trying to come up with a way to get Naomi out of his house and out of Silver Creek Valley for good. "My, I have never seen such a beauty before in my entire life," Ray continued, and Carl chuckled and wondered what his deputy would say if he caught a glimpse of Naomi. "I can see I'm not the only one who thinks an angel has descended upon us. Come take a look, Carl. I bet if your mail-order bride looked anything like this beauty, you would have been heading to the preacher's house by now." He chortled. Sighing, Carl grudgingly pushed himself to his feet and almost had apoplexy when he looked out the window and saw Naomi, looking resplendent in a blue dress with white lace and enjoying the attention men were lavishing on her. "I swear I'll kill that woman," he swore savagely, and darted out of the office. Chapter 6. "Hey, purty gal. What's a purty little thing like you doing in a place like this? Can I buy you a drink, missy?" Naomi blushed a fiery red at all the attention she was getting from the men in town. She hadn't expected it, and even though it was quite bold of them, it felt good that they all saw her as pretty and wanted to buy her a drink, unlike the oaf who she had traded words with earlier. The men were all dressed alike in straw hats, bandanas at their napes, with dirty-looking shirts and trousers, as well as dusty boots. When they smiled at her, she could see the stains tobacco had made on their teeth, and one of them had a cup he spat into every now and then. Within the twinkling of an eye, 5 of them were all around her and giving her appraisals that made her color heighten. "Why, thank you, kind sir. I'd love that," she told the man who offered to buy her a drink and gave him a smile which raised his bushy brows. Then she realized what she had just told the man, and her eyes widened in horror. Her ego must have taken a severe beating from Carl's words for her to have agreed to such a preposterous question. The men shared glances she didn't quite understand, and then she knew for sure that it wasn't a wise idea going with the man to a saloon to have a drink. A stranger at that. She didn't know the rules of propriety in the West, but she believed the rules in Pennsylvania also applied here. She opened her mouth to kindly retract her statement when all of a sudden the men started parting like the Red Sea of old, and she saw the last person she wanted to see in the world. And from his stony glare, he wasn't glad to see her either. He had his thumbs hooked in his belt, and a stance like that of a tiger poised to pounce on its prey at any minute. Oh, fudge! What was he doing here? A glance behind him told her why he was there. She saw a building with the words "Sheriff's Office" inscribed on it and cursed her luck. Of all the places she chose to pause to take in the architectural beauty of the town, it had to be in front of his office. It was the mercantile store across the road that had caused her to stop and stare, for it brought back memories of her father's. But if she had known opposite, it was where he worked, she would have continued walking and even gladly hiked for the rest of her life than be faced with his censure, which she could plainly read in his eyes. What would she do now? Brazen it out was what she had to do. But why was she even on the defensive? She was doing no wrong. In fact, he didn't have a right being there. He didn't fancy her, so why should he stop other men from admiring her? She'd be darned if she allowed him to dictate to her. Batting her eyelids and hoping what she was giving one of the cowboys was a flirtatious smile, she said, "Please lead the way, kind sir." The cowboy hooted and offered her his arm, but his face turned a dark hue when they all heard the sheriff's curt warning. "Put your hand on her, Buck, and I'll lead you to the station." "Dang it," Buck muttered into the silence that had fallen around them after the sheriff's words. "Begging your pardon, Sheriff. I didn't know she'd be your woman." The poor man stepped back, as did the other cowboys. Thrusting out her chin, a trait she seemed to do only when the obnoxious man was around her, she glared at him. "I am not his woman, and you'll never be." He threw back at her, and the cowboys whistled at the apparent animosity between the two of them. "A storm's a-brewin'," said one of them. Not used to being so ill-tempered, particularly in public, Naomi turned a rosy hue and swung away from the men. An iron grip on her arm made her pause. She refused to give him the satisfaction of turning to look at him, so she stared straight ahead. "Where are you off to?" She remained silent, pursing her lips in a mutinous line. "Off to cause more disturbances to the townsfolk with your presence?" That got to her, and she turned to give him a disdainful glare that lifted his brows before yanking her arm from his hand. "You're the most obnoxious man I have ever had the misfortune to meet." "Shut up," he ordered in a thunderous voice, and glanced around him. Only then did Naomi realize that their confrontation was causing quite a stir among the townsfolk. She didn't know if it was her imagination, but the place seemed quieter than when the ranch hand had helped her alight from the wagon a few minutes ago. The shoe shiners in front of the shops didn't have their attention on the shoes anymore, and neither did their customers. Even the ladies in front of the salon adjacent to the sheriff's office were staring at them with keen interest. Passers-by had halted and were pretending to be window shopping. Taking her arm, Carl practically dragged her into the building that housed his office and pushed her into the room. "Please excuse us, Ray, and kindly shut the door behind you," Carl ordered between clenched teeth. Ray, who had been staring out the window before they came in, walked to where Naomi was standing, looking embarrassed, and brought forth his hand. "You must be Naomi. Mighty glad to meet such a fine lady as you. I was to—" "Ray," Carl snapped and tilted his head curtly towards the door. His subordinate appeared as if he wanted to argue, but he shrugged, winked at her, and shut the door quietly. Carl pushed himself from the wall and crossed the room in 2 strides. She wasn't intimidated by his approach. She simply played with the strings of her reticule and avoided his gaze. "Where's your chaperone?" She shrugged and said in a nonchalant manner she knew was sure to make him angrier, "She was doing the laundry when I decided to hitch a ride with one of the ranch hands into town." Naomi almost burst into laughter when his color darkened, his eyes narrowed to slits, and he lifted both hands and made them claw-like, as if he would love nothing better than to wrap them around her neck and wring it. He swung away from her abruptly and strode to the door to snatch it open and slam it hard. She heard his angry footsteps outside the door as if he was pacing, and she allowed a small giggle to escape her lips. Trading words with him wasn't the way to handle such an arrogant man, she decided. She would use indifference to rile him. After all, it wasn't her fault that he had a short leash on his temper. After what seemed like eons in the office, she wondered if he planned on leaving her there all day while he stewed outside. She didn't have long to wonder when the door opened, and with his face still as if carved from stone, he brusquely said, "Let's go." A little trepidation ran through her body, but she squelched it. There was no way Carl would be so angry he would cause her harm. He was the sheriff, for crying out loud. Well, that didn't make him immune to crime, but she didn't think he'd go that far. Go to where? She tried to keep her voice steady and hide the fear she felt. Oh, the ranch? Or perhaps you prefer the train station? In your dreams. Lead the way. After you, he insisted, and after swallowing thickly, she walked to the door and he moved just a little for her to pass. She almost plastered herself against the wall just so her body wouldn't brush against his. The boar didn't bother helping her up the wagon he hired, and she had to struggle to climb on. He also didn't apologize when he flipped the reins for the horses to start moving, and their motion was so sudden she nearly fell off her seat. The exasperating man just looked straight ahead, totally ignoring her. To get back at him, she waved at the cowboys who were whistling as they rode by and even went as far as blowing them kisses. From the corner of her eye, she saw his hands tighten on the reins and felt sorry for the poor horses. He got his own back when they were out of town, and he called her a foul name that had her lips parting in surprise. She wanted to strike back with harsh words, but then she remembered her resolve to use indifference to get to him. So she turned away from him and focused her attention on the beautiful countryside with its grasslands and intimidating mountains. It was, however, difficult to remain indifferent when he practically dragged her from the wagon after the tense ride to the ranch and into the house. He lifted his forefinger at her and gave her a stern warning. Never go anywhere without your chaperone for as long as you're in my house. Naomi bit back an angry retort and casually said, "What is it? Afraid of a little competition?" She grasped her words were a huge mistake when his face became a mask of fury, and he tore into her with words, like a lion devouring his first meal in days. "I can see clearly now why you ran away from wherever you came from. If your display just now in town is anything to go by, it was because of a scandal, wasn't it? Were you caught in a compromising situation with a man, or was it men? You without a doubt have no decorum and no sense of propriety. You're nothing but a brazen little hussy who deceived Winston into bringing you here. If you know what's good for you, you'll take the next train back to the immoral hole you crawled out from, or I'll make your life so miserable here that when you do finally decide to leave, you won't have time to shake the dust off your feet." Red color suffused Naomi's heated face. She had never been violent in her life. In fact, she didn't think she had a single violent streak in her body, but at that moment, she felt like drawing back her hand and socking him in the nose for all the insults he just threw at her, then scratching his eyes out with her nails. But she put a tight rein on her emotions. She was hurt, horrified, and humiliated beyond what she had ever felt in her life. Pain rose in her heart at all the false accusations, scorn, and contempt he had just leveled against her. Angry tears glazed her eyes, but she hastily blinked them back. Indifference, she reminded herself. Hit back with apathy. Don't allow him to see how much he's hurt you. Her lips twitched in a smile, as if she knew something he didn't. You're the vilest man I have ever met, but you don't scare me one bit. She eyed him sneeringly. Do your worst, Sheriff. Let's see who'll run out of town with his tail between his legs. Little chit, he hissed. She smiled seductively at him. You talked about scandal? Believe me, you don't know the meaning of the word. By the time I'm done with you, scandal will take on a whole new meaning to you. Without saying a word, he swung on his heels and left her standing there, wishing she could jump on his back and hit him repeatedly. Insufferable lout. Contemptuous cur. Arrogant yob. Naomi wanted to scream till her voice became hoarse. Never had she met a man who rubbed her the wrong way. What was it about him that made her act out of character? She had to do something. He couldn't get away with all the insults he threw her way. She wasn't vengeful by nature, but she had to show Carl she didn't quite care for his threats, and she wouldn't be intimidated by him. Lifting her skirts, she hurried to her room to think of what she could do to him. She passed the kitchen and retraced her steps. Anna was there humming a song as she peeled potatoes. An idea came into Naomi's mind, and she smiled mischievously. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. After a tiresome day, Carl stood at the kitchen door and let out a deep sigh. He felt like a child again when he didn't come home early after playing with his friends, and already knew what his punishment would be. His mother would take her wooden spoon to his hide, but this was somewhat different, because he had no idea what was in store for him behind the door. It wasn't as if he was scared of Naomi or anything. It was himself he was afraid of. All the while he was yelling at her, his body was reacting to her proximity. She had no idea that when she was angry, she became even more beautiful, like a flaming angel with that red hair of hers. He sighed heavily again. Never in his life had he yelled at a woman. But not only had he done that afternoon, he had also threatened one. If she did one more thing to annoy him that evening, he would give in to the temptation of pulling her across his lap and giving her pert backside the smacking it deserved after he kissed all the fight out of her. You can't be having such thoughts about her, he castigated himself. Naomi would drive him crazy if he gave her the chance. Here he was, too wary to go into his own house and afraid there might be another shouting match between the two of them. Watch your back, Carl, Ray had warned after he told him what transpired between him and the chit. Hell hath no fury like a woman scorned. Carl scoffed. Hell hath no fury like a man who wants peace and quiet after a hard day's work. Deciding that he would entirely ignore her, he pushed open the door and slowly walked into the kitchen that was filled with a delicious aroma. He saw his quarry laughing animatedly with his brother at the table without acknowledging his presence. Carl, good of you to join us. Come take a seat. Naomi was kind enough to whip up some grub. Kind enough? Was he referring to the same Naomi he knew to be a shrew? The food most likely contained poison. If he wasn't so hungry, he would have ignored both of them and stormed to his room. But when he saw the beef stew, mashed potatoes, freshly baked bread, and boiled vegetables on the table, his stomach rumbled, and he decided to take his chances. He shut the door and took water from a pitcher to wash his hands. All this while, Naomi was still talking and laughing with Winston, as if her life depended on it, and for some reason it grated on his nerves. He stood ramrod still as she threw back her head and rich laughter bubbled from her throat, giving him a clear picture of her lovely neck. Her joviality softened her features. He was wrong. She was even more beautiful when she was laughing and happy. Why couldn't she smile at him like this? Why couldn't she laugh with him like this? He snapped himself out of his errant thoughts, and a frown puckered his face when he realized what she was doing. The dang chit was flirting with his brother. She was plying her trade in his presence. He wiped any fond thought of her from his mind and pulled out the chair beside his brother and sat. He stared suspiciously at his covered meal and lifted his gaze to the infuriating woman. But her attention was still focused on Winston at the other side of the table. What the... He rose abruptly in anger when his gaze met the charred food on the plate. The beef, potatoes, and vegetables were all burnt. Winston stared at the burnt offering with amazement and then burst into raucous laughter. Carl's angry gaze settled on Naomi, and he was surprised when she stared right back at him, unwavering. After holding her steady gaze with his for some minutes without her backing down, he angrily pushed back his chair, not caring that it toppled over, before marching out of the kitchen while his stupid brother was still laughing. Outside, he inhaled the cool night breeze and willed it to calm the rage inside him. After a moment, though, he headed for the bunkhouse. He couldn't spend the night under the same roof with Naomi. There was every possibility that he would wring her neck before morning. What the heck had Winston gotten him into? His life was going on just fine before she came. He came home to a quiet house, and, after discussions with his brother during dinner, he would retire to his room where he would sleep peacefully. But now serene sleep was far from him, all because Winston had decided to meddle in his affairs. As Carl strode into the night, which was illuminated by the light from the moon, he remembered how he had gone to the office of the Matrimonial Times to place an ad for a bride. That was after Winston had talked his ears sore. He had thought it was a good idea at the time, but standing there and remembering Grace got him rushing out like the devil was chasing him. He wished now that he had toughened it out and ordered his own bride instead of the disreputable lady he was now saddled with, who seemed like a bad toothache that wouldn't go. Chapter 7. The following morning, Naomi felt very silly for what she had done the previous night. She had never before gone out of her way to hurt someone, and the fact that she had done so made her sad. She had waited all night for Carl to return, but he didn't, which made her feel even worse. She had not only denied him his dinner, which was his right, she had also deprived him of his bed. In her estimation, that was cruel, and she felt terrible. Winston had tried to talk her out of feeling awful by telling her it was what Carl deserved for treating her in such a shabby manner, but Naomi knew better. Kindness can change even the hardest of hearts, Mama used to say, and Naomi was ashamed that she hadn't heeded the late woman's words. Mama would be turning in her grave at what I've become, she muttered, and twined her hands in discomfiture. Papa, too, would be shocked that she had been mean to someone, she whom he called my sweet little girl. Maybe he wouldn't be surprised. After all, she had practically left her husband to be at the altar. Even though she suspected Will didn't have a heart, she must have hurt something in him, perhaps his ego. "Oh, Papa, I miss you," she cried, as thoughts of her father flooded her mind. She wondered what he was up to. How did he take her hasty departure? Was he still looking for her? Was he in danger? Will was a dangerous man, so she wondered if he had left her father alone or decided to torture him. She was so worried about him, she was tempted to write him a letter, but feared Will would find out and also discover her hideout. Oh, fudge. She sat heavily on the bed and dabbed at her eyes with her dainty handkerchief. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. I swear, I don't know where she is. I've told you that 1,000 times, Benjamin Hart shouted. Your words don't mean nothing, Tommy. William Branson snapped at the man and took a drag from his cigar, blowing thick smoke in the air. He regarded the man seated before him with derision, and a nasty snarl curled his lips. Let me make myself clear, Benjamin. If I don't get to marry ya last, you wouldn't like what I'll do, I assure ya." Benjamin swallowed thickly, and Will smiled with satisfaction. He had frightened the stupid man well enough for him to try to reach his daughter, to tell her to be careful and keep safe. When he did that, he would have him cornered like a rat and smash him. But that was after he made Naomi his. Naomi. His blood flared just thinking of the red-haired beauty. He remembered the first time he had set eyes on her. He was taking a ride at the park and saw her having a picnic with a frail-looking woman who was obviously her mother. He wasn't one to be moved by the sight of a woman, but one look at her angelic face and he was hooked. After making discreet inquiries, he found out who she was and the family she was from. He began watching her wherever she went, and on 2 occasions he put himself within her radius, but she looked right past him, as if he was an inconsequential being. That greatly annoyed him, because he had never been smitten by a woman before, and she had shunned him. He swore that she would be his, come what may. He began to study her father and his business, and it wasn't long before he planted people to start sabotaging the store so he could have something to hold over him. Great was his joy when news got to him that Benjamin was in desperate need of money to save his ailing wife. He planted someone who spoke into Benjamin's ears about coming to him for a loan, and he did his best to make sure Naomi's father couldn't pay him back. He had thought everything was going his way when he had insisted that if Benjamin couldn't pay his money, then he had to give him his daughter's hand in marriage. The annoying man had offered to go to debtor's prison, but he had told him it was either his daughter or all his money back in 1 month. An intense frown crossed Will's face in remembrance of the indifference Naomi had shown him when he invited himself for dinner one night so they could be acquainted. She had treated him like a nobody, as if he wasn't there. She had no idea that had strengthened his resolve to marry her. He smiled when he remembered how she and her friend had come to his office to beg him to change his mind. Well, her friend had come begging, but Naomi had come demanding, and when he refused, she had thrown an insult at him, making him want her all the more because he liked his women feisty, and she was one spirited girl. He had thought victory was his when she agreed to marry him, but pleaded to be given 6 months for her to complete mourning her mother. She had also supplied the ruse that she had always wanted to get married on her birthday, which was in 6 months. He had been so blinded by his taste of victory, he had accepted her proposal and tolerated her theatrics those months, in not wanting him to hold her hand when he took her to the opera and to the park for the sake of modesty, even when she had a chaperone. His hands tightened into fists and his brow creased in a frown when he remembered waiting endlessly in church for her that morning and becoming increasingly embarrassed as the few guests he invited began questioning what was going on. A messenger who was sent to her house returned with the news that she had run away and was nowhere to be found. Rage had held him speechless for some minutes before he bellowed to his men to search every nook and cranny for her, and he had been searching ever since. He had the suspicion that Benjamin knew where his daughter was and was shielding her. No one made a fool of him and got away with it. No one. He swung in Benjamin's direction and declared menacingly, "If I don't marry her, no one will." Chapter 8. I knew I'd find you here. Carl slowly turned around at the sound of his brother's voice. He half feared that he would bring that woman along with him to this sacred place, but he let out a little sigh of relief when he saw that Winston was alone. The early November sky was cloudy and looked as if it would open and drench the land with its moisture soon. Dried leaves chased one another across the yard as a gusty wind blew. The two men stood at the circular clearing that was surrounded by wildflowers and stared at the marble marker. Carl glared intently at the grave where death had held his wife in its grip for the past 3 years. It was the memorial of Grace's death, and he wasn't in a good mood. He felt like smashing something. It wasn't fair that such a sweet and gentle soul hadn't been given the chance to live life to its full course. It was such a terrible thing that the wife he thought he would grow old with was snatched away from him, and he hadn't been able to do anything about it. A fond smile danced around his lips when he remembered the first time he set eyes on Grace. He had thought that he had died and gone to heaven. What an angelic picture she made with her glorious blonde curls, homespun calico dress, and a face that an artist would spend hours painting just to capture its essence. She had such an innocent face, and when she smiled, he could swear he heard angels singing. He had just been made sheriff prior to their meeting. Ray had to nudge him forward before he took in that he was just standing there, staring at her as she set the table for lunch. They had received information that there was a disturbance at the stagecoach stop which her father owned. So they swung by to settle the dispute between the drunken hands. And Carl had lost his heart to her. It was an effort keeping his eyes off her, even though he caught her father's frowning glare every now and then. They had been invited for lunch, and although Ray wanted them to head back into town, Carl had jumped at the chance of spending more time just gaping at her. And so he had found one excuse or another to be at the relay station every opportunity he got. He had been ecstatic when news reached him of outlaws hitting the place due to the wealthy passengers that passed through. So he and his team of deputies had manned the place for some days to help the soldiers at the fort foil the attack. That was when he got to really know Grace and fall in love with her. It was her duty, along with that of her 3 younger sisters, to help the cook with the meals. So Carl used it as an opening to get to talk to her all the time when she served his meals. Everyone at the station knew they couldn't keep their eyes off each other except her father, who was busy running the place. When their assignment came to an end and they had to go back to town, Carl had been touched when he saw tears in Grace's eyes at the time he came to say goodbye to her. She tried to hide it, but he put his hand under her chin and gently elevated it so her sky-blue eyes could meet his. "I'm going to miss you, Grace. I want to thank you for your hospitality," he had told her in a hoarse voice. A tear slid down her cheek, and seeing the singular line thread down her face made him lose control. He wrapped her in his arms and placed his lips on hers. It was fortunate that they were at her favorite spot in the meadows, or he was sure he would have received a bullet in his back from her father's gun at daring to put his arms and lips on his daughter. "I love you." The words had been drawn out of him, and when he saw a smile that would rival the sun plastered on her face at his declaration, he felt peace so serene he wanted to burst into song. "I love you too," she shared shyly. He had been unable to stop himself from kissing her again before putting her from him. "We're going to do this properly. I'm going to approach your father, and we're going to get married as soon as we can find a preacher." Her joyous laughter had been all the motivation he needed to approach her father, who was an ornery old cuss. "No!" the man had shouted and wheezed after Carl had made his intentions known. You came here to do a job and not marry my daughter, so no." "But Papa," Grace had rushed into the small living room and fallen at her father's feet with tears running down her lovely face. Carl had had no idea she had been listening in on their conversation. "I love him," she stated passionately. Wheezing, the rotund man said, "What do you know about love, lass? I suppose your mother, bless her lovely soul, filled your head with all the love nonsense." Pouting prettily, Grace remarked, "Well, she told me how you chased her around her father's ranch all the time, proclaiming your love until she pitied your poor self and agreed to marry you." The man threw back his head and laughed heartily before succumbing to a bout of coughing. "I reckon she told you about the time I came calling with a bunch of flowers in my hands, looking every inch the fool, and her father caught me declaring my love for her, chased me across 3 counties he did afore he agreed to let her go." Father and daughter shared another laugh, while Carl just stood there feeling out of place. The robust man finally lifted his head to inspect the tall, dark, and handsome man with critical eyes. "But he's a sheriff, me lass. He might not always come home to you. I reckon one of those renegades or cattle rustlers would have put a bullet in his back afore you have your first wee one." A small frown tracked across Carl's face. It was nice to know his prospective father-in-law didn't think he would live long enough to see his first child. "Oh, Papa." Grace's distress at her father's words was evident in her eyes, and he longed to reach out to her and comfort her, but her father might just take a stick to him because he was staring at him something fierce. The man raised his beefy hands. "All right." Then he fastened a glare on Carl. "You can have her hand in marriage." Grace shrieked with delight and clapped her hands with joy. She leaned closer and kissed him on his robust cheek before throwing her arms around him. But the man directed his stern gaze at Carl even though his daughter's hands were still clasped around his stiff neck. "She ever comes to me crying that you laid a finger on her, I'm going to bring out my good old rifle and shoot you between your eyes. Comprehend?" Carl had hidden a laugh by clearing his throat and saying firmly, "Yes, sir." Grace had swung to look at him with amusement in her eyes that was reflected in his own. "You young'uns of nowadays don't know how to treat a woman right. Good-for-nothing fellas, the lot of you," the man continued grumbling, oblivious that his daughter and the sheriff were smiling at each other with love in their eyes. 3 weeks later they were married, and Grace had tearfully left the only house she had ever known to live with him and Winston at the ranch. What bliss he had known married to her. With a tender smile on his face, he recalled coming home during the day, which she insisted he did every day unless he was out of town, to a delicious meal in a very clean house. She placed flowers in every room, and the whole house always smelled lovely, and because she enjoyed baking, the ranch hands always came in for her special dinner rolls they couldn't stop talking about. When news came to them after just 3 months of their marriage that her father was dying, Grace had insisted on going to nurse him at the relay station. Grudgingly, he had accepted, and she had stayed there a month with the old man until he passed away in his sleep one night. Grace had been inconsolable. Following his funeral, she had returned home, but something had changed in her. Carl, with a heavy heart, watched his wife waste away. The smile that usually graced her face appeared to have disappeared for good, leaving a hollowness that tore at his heart. After summoning doctors to help diagnose what was wrong with her, he was told that, in nursing her father, Grace had caught the disease and she too would die in a matter of months. Tuberculosis, they said, which was why, whenever she coughed, blood came out with her spittle. Carl remembered the anguish he had felt at the news. He had been devastated. Nothing anyone said mattered to him anymore, and he had spent his every moment with his wife, who kept apologizing for the fact that she would soon leave him when they had planned on doing so many things together. He was warned that he could catch the disease also, but he didn't care. What was life without Grace by his side? 6 months into their marriage, she died in his arms one morning, and his heart broke into fragments that he didn't think would ever be pieced back together. For the first time in his life, he had wept like a baby, and Winston had been there to offer him his shoulder. The sun had gone out of his life, and he embraced the darkness with gladness. Life with Grace had been beautiful and boring, a tiny voice said in his mind, and it shocked him. No, life with Grace hadn't been boring, he denied vehemently. Granted, they never argued because she was such a sweet little thing, and he never found any reason to be angry with her. He had loved her with his whole heart, and if there was an opportunity for him to marry her again in the afterlife, he would do so without a second thought. He closed his eyes and tried to picture her as she was every time he came home, standing by the front door with a welcoming smile on her face, but instead he saw a redhead with brown eyes yelling at him at the top of her voice. Little minx! His lips tightened. She couldn't even allow him to mourn his wife in peace without creeping into his thoughts. Winston placed a comforting hand on his shoulder and bent to place his own bouquet of flowers beside Carl's. "She's been gone 3 years, Carl," Winston said after a moment had passed. A scowl covered his brother's face. "Please don't start. Not today of all days." Winston curved his body in his direction. "Especially today of all days. She wouldn't have wanted you to mourn her this long. Grace was such a lovable person. She particularly told me not to allow you to throw your life away holding on to her." The sheriff simply turned away without a word and headed for the stables. He saddled his horse and headed into town. His escape from such torturous memories was his work, but unfortunately his office was locked, and he couldn't get a hold of the keys. It was Ray's doing, because the dang man had told him to take the day off the previous night because he knew what today meant to him. "As if he's my boss," Carl grumbled and turned his horse to head back to the ranch. The first person he saw as he entered that house was the witch who troubled his thoughts and dreams. "Today just isn't my day," he murmured. Chapter 9. "Good morning, Sheriff," Naomi hailed cheerfully, hoping the tears she had shed inside her room weren't noticeable in her eyes. She hadn't expected his reply to be as jolly as hers was, but she also hadn't expected the scowl that now covered his face. Hooking his thumbs in the loops of his belt, he regarded her with a mixture of scorn and indecision, and tersely remarked, "Pray tell, what's good about the morning?" She opened her mouth to tell him what her mother always said, that it was a gift to be alive and one should be grateful for it, but he forestalled her by answering his own question. "I don't see what's good about the morning, not when you're still here making a nuisance of yourself." Despite her resolve to be nice to him, she couldn't help throwing at him, "What's got your britches in a knot, Sheriff? Lady of the Night didn't treat you well last night." A slight shiver went over her, and she feared she might have gone too far when his face darkened with anger and his eyes became so fierce she was afraid he might lift his hand and smack her across the cheek. She would deserve it for that unwise crack she just made. "Leave before I strangle you one of these days." he ground out with clenched teeth and stalked out of her presence. Naomi raised a hand to her pounding heart and thought for an instant to take his advice, or he might really just carry out his threat. But where would she go? Back home? There was nothing for her over there anymore. She didn't think the loan shark would still hold it over her father for her to marry him, but she didn't want to take chances. A shadow of sadness crossed her features. She hadn't thought for a moment that she would be rejected by the one man. Truth be told, she would love to be called his woman. True, he was arrogant, obnoxious, irritating, and so much more she didn't desire in a man, but there was something about him that drew her to him. Young though she was, she recognized that there was something between them, a spark that put them at each other's throats all the time. She didn't quite know whether it was a good thing or terrible, but she was determined to find out. Naomi made her way to the kitchen for breakfast and was surprised to see Carl there with his hands in his trouser pockets, just staring at the stove with a forlorn look in his eyes. There was something about his stance that tugged at her heartstrings and made her pause to survey him. He was really a fine specimen of a man, with his dark hair falling across his forehead that made her itch to reach out and pull it back. She wouldn't be surprised if he came back home bald, if she dared try that, because all he ever wanted to do was fight with her. But seeing him like this, looking so sad, made her think she had misjudged him. Perhaps he was just a lonely man who had reasons why he didn't want to marry her. Maybe, if she could find out his reasons and get to understand them, she might discover what made him tick, instead of fighting with him all the time, tired of just standing there, staring at him surreptitiously. She made her presence known by sweeping into the room. He jerked in her direction, and their eyes met and held. Her mouth parted and became dry. Breathe, breathe, Naomi reminded herself as her lungs cried for help. A warm glow seeped into her cheeks, and she quickly looked away. Jesus, now you're stalking me? He asked with fury. No, She was still struck with discomfiture at his hot gaze, but he wasn't letting her off the hook easily. You what? She opened her mouth to say something, but oddly, nothing came out. Giving her a sneer, he briskly strode from the kitchen, but not before snapping a last retort. Stay away from me. That went well, Naomi mumbled when he was gone. So much for trying to be nice to him. She put him from her mind when Anna came into the kitchen to have her breakfast after doing her chores. Naomi chatted amicably with her, but when she wanted to step out of the house to head to the stables to look at the beautiful horses there, the maid stopped her. Wringing her hands with unease, the young girl said, "Begging your pardon, missus, but you can't leave the house." Excuse me? Naomi's brows arched on her forehead. Anna lowered her eyes to avoid her mistress's questioning gaze. Master Carl be telling me not to let you go out. Oh, he did he? Anna nodded like a lizard, that lout. He didn't want to marry her, but thought he could give her orders? She had been wrong to think she could be nice to him when he was nothing but a condescending brute, and she would have words with him. Catching a glimpse of him from the kitchen window as he headed to the stables, she hurried out of the kitchen, ignoring Anna's calls. The sky had a golden sheen that resembled pure honey sprinkled on its surface. Sunlight hit her on the forehead, causing it to bead with sweat, and she wished she had put on her hat. The insufferable man was leading a horse out of the stall when she stormed into the stables. She irrelevantly noticed that he wasn't wearing his uniform. It was the first time she was seeing him without it. He had on a cream cotton shirt and black pants. His eyebrows raised at her harried appearance, and she dropped her skirts and opened her mouth to cuss him out, but he hindered her again by snapping, "I thought I told you to stay away from me." She ignored his words and rasped, "Am I to become a prisoner in your house?" Understanding dawned in his eyes at the cause of her ire, and a smile so charming that her anger diffused for some seconds at the sight crossed his face. He strode to her and folded his arms across his chest. His features became boyish, and she wished he would always smile at her like this. Then she quickly squashed the errant thought. "Well, since you refuse to make yourself scarce from my presence and I'm sheriff, I don't intend for you to go around causing trouble in my town." Her hands fisted at her sides and itched to whack him in the nose, but she controlled herself, reciting her mother's words on kindness in her head. "How can I, lil' me, cause any trouble in this place?" He cocked an arrogant eyebrow at her, and then his eyes trailed her body, beginning from her hair, drawn back from her face and held back by pins, down her peach dress and slippers. He placed his arms akimbo and gave her quite a look that made her all warm on the inside, but she thrust out her chin and looked him straight in the eyes. "Have you looked at yourself in the mirror lately?" His tone was condescending and contemptuous. Hot color stained her cheeks as she comprehended what he was trying to say. A thrill made her heartbeat increase with the knowledge that he found her beautiful enough to cause a distraction. Her red lips parted over her teeth, and she snaked her tongue to wet her lips, trying to come up with something to say, but her brain had gone blank. "And we both know you have the morals of a woman who works on her back," he added with savage bite. "Why, you—" Anger mixed with hurt churned inside her. Too incensed to heed her mother's words, she lifted her hand to strike his face, but he gripped it and jerked her forward to breathe down hard at her. Enraged brown eyes held the gaze of infuriated blue ones that suddenly started changing into a darker hue. His hand dropped from hers and cupped her face in a caress that made her lean into it. When his head descended, it only seemed natural for her to elevate her lips towards his. The loud neighing of a horse made them dart away from each other, and she discovered she couldn't stop shaking. He swore furiously as he stalked towards the stalls. "I should have known." He ran his fingers through his tousled hair. Naomi ignored him and tried to bring her breathing back under control. Her fingers shook as she reached up to make sure none of her pins had come undone. How shameful that the man had come within an inch of her and she practically threw herself on him. What he must think of her now when he already had a low opinion of her. Her thoughts were confirmed a second later when she heard his voice like a whiplash. "I should have known this was your plan all along. You plan on getting me to marry you by seducing me. Have you no shame? What kind of a woman are you?" Naomi's jaw dropped at the unfair accusation. She gave him a look of sheer disgust. "Seduce you? I'd rather seduce a hedgehog. If I remember correctly, you were the one who grabbed me and manhandled me, you buffoon." He raised a warning finger at her. "Be very mindful of your words." Or what? She simmered like a cauldron threatening to boil over. Do I have to keep doing this? Both of them jerked in the direction of Winston's voice. Naomi took some steps backward from the infuriating man while he took angry strides to the stall. Why can't the two of you just get along? Must I come along every time to separate you two from fighting like siblings warring over a wooden toy? Winston glanced from one to the other with his hands on his hips. They both gave him angry glares that brought amusement into his eyes. When neither of them said a word, he grinned and said, A good game of cards ought to douse this tension between you two. Come along, he invited, raising his hand towards Naomi. Never one to stay angry for long, Naomi couldn't resist smiling at the man who was grinning boyishly at her. She walked towards him. "What about you, brother? Been a while since I beat you silly," he jeered. "Ha," Carl scoffed. "You've never beaten me in a game of cards, you lying cad." Winston laughed and boasted, "I reckon you'd be eating your words an hour from now." Carl hesitated for a minute before agreeing to join them. Winston led the way back to the house, all the while telling her how their father had taught them to play cards and how they watched him and their mother play all the time. Naomi smiled affectionately at his tale. She didn't know his late parents, but from his words, she could feel the love they had had for each other. When they got to the living room and Winston brought out the pack of cards, Naomi had to admit to him she didn't know how to play and took a seat to watch the two men. She enjoyed simply sitting there and studying them as they engaged each other in healthy rivalry. She laughed a number of times at the way they teased each other. Although she glanced at Winston every now and then, her attention was solely on Carl. She studied the way the corners of his eyes crinkled at the edges when he was deep in concentration. From time to time, he would place his elbow on his knee and put his hand under his chin to view with those deep eyes of his the cards in his other hand. There were times when his free hand would go into his dark tresses to draw them back, and she would fold her hands tautly because she itched to do it for him. His teasing smile at his brother always made her catch her breath a little, and she wished he would smile at her like that sometime. Her pallor turned a crimson red when she raised her eyes and discovered that Carl had caught her watching him. She prepared herself for his caustic remark, but he just stared fixedly at her, and for some reason she couldn't look away, held captive by his flaring gaze. Winston cleared his throat loudly, hiding a smile behind his cards as he broke the stare between them. Naomi found herself on her feet without initially having the intention of doing so. I'm off to bed," she stammered, keeping her gaze above the two men. "So early?" Carl mockingly questioned, but she refused to look at him. I have a bit of a headache." "Well, good night then." Swirling, she bade Winston good night and hastily departed to her room. Anna helped her undress, and when she slipped into the cool bed, she sighed with contentment. Sleep was far from coming because she couldn't get her thoughts far from Carl. Her heart yearned for him to like her and agree to marry her, but she also had her dignity. Surely, she couldn't go about trying to get him to like her as he had accused, although he had gone too far in laying the blame on her for trying to seduce him, a trade she had no knowledge about. But would it really be bad if she were to try to correct the wrong impression he had of her? She couldn't stay here forever without a promise of marriage, even if she had all the women there acting as chaperones. Naomi worried her bottom lip. She was sure she liked Carl, and if she could get him to like her, her journey here wouldn't be in vain. Smiling at the plan she would put into motion the following day, she closed her eyes and embraced the oblivion sleep brought. Chapter 10. "Ain't you a beautiful ray of sunshine this morning?" Winston announced cheerfully the following morning, as Naomi gracefully pirouetted into the kitchen. She had taken care in dressing that morning. Donning one of her new dresses, a pretty moss green one with white lace ruffles, and binding her hair with a ribbon at her nape, seemed a sensible idea in carrying out her plan. He had wrongly charged her with being a seductress, and she might as well prove his words true. Now, If only she knew how to coerce a man into liking her. Her spirit sank when the man in question didn't deign to even bestow her with a glance. Intent on eating his breakfast, he didn't bother to acknowledge her presence. Winston, as gentlemanly as ever, rose and drew out a chair for her. His smile was a balm to her frayed nerves, as her plan seemed to take a nosedive. How was she to get the man to like her when he didn't look her way? "Thank you, Winston. Good morning. I trust you had a splendid night," she said, as she sat and looked everywhere, but at the man seated before her, buttering his wheat bread. "Even if I didn't, the sight of you has smoothed over any rough night I might have had." Naomi let out a giggle as Winston poured coffee into a cup for her. Deciding it was best to ignore Carl since he wanted to do the same to her, she poured thick cream from a pitcher into her cup. "What do you propose to do with yourself this morning?" Winston asked cheerfully as he resumed his seat. Smiling at him, she said, "Since I'm to become a prisoner in this house, I was thinking maybe you could teach me how to ride a horse. I've been fascinated by horses since I was a little girl, but never had the opportunity to ride them." "Prisoner?" His eyebrows raised, and he looked from his silent brother to her. Naomi shook her head, indicating with her eyes that he should let it go. He shrugged and said, "You're a lucky little thing then to find yourself on a ranch." "Unfortunately, I can't teach you." She was crestfallen. "Why?" "I won't be here." "Oh, then I'll just wait for you to come back." "You can't because I might be gone for weeks. We're rounding up the cattle before winter, and I hope to be able to sell all of them. But... She couldn't begin to imagine the kind young man gone from the ranch. Without him to intervene, she and Carl might very well kill each other. "Not to worry, Carl here will teach you," Winston announced joyfully, and his brother made choking sounds as his coffee went down the wrong way. He coughed fitfully. "What?" he managed to say when he was done coughing. With a wry grin, Winston declared, "I think it's a brilliant idea. Ray told me you have a few days off work, so you have time on your hands to teach her." The angry man scoffed. "I'd rather be drawn and quartered than teach her how to ride a horse. I will not do anything to encourage her continued stay here." Silence fell at the breakfast table over his outburst, and Naomi quickly lowered her eyes in order for him not to see the hurt in them. So much for wanting him to like her. Why did he hate her so much? What had she done to deserve such scorn, except innocently come here thinking she was going to be married? "I bet Mama is turning in her grave right now and itching to take up her wooden spoon to your hide." "What a perfect gentleman she raised," Winston taunted mercilessly, and sat back to fold his arms across his chest. Naomi lifted her head a little and saw Carl gritting his teeth. If he became madder than he already was, she wouldn't be surprised to see smoke coming out of his ears. He looked ready to bite off his brother's head. "Fine," he snapped and pushed himself to his feet. "But you better come back quickly, or you might just find that I've strangled her or bundled her into her trunk and sent her back where she crawled out from." "That went pretty well," Winston commented casually after his brother irately left the kitchen. Naomi shook her head. "I've changed my mind. I don't want to learn anymore." "Come now, don't tell me I just escaped having Carl put a bullet in me for nothing." She was silent at that. "Naomi, please don't give up now. Your spirit has been the thing keeping you here. Don't allow him to kill it. Tarry on just a little while and you'll smile in the end." He sounded desperate. Confusion was etched on her face. "What are you talking about?" He clasped her hand on the table. "You'll understand soon enough. Please don't give up." Like her, Winston too was daydreaming of things going well between her and his brother. That was becoming unlikelier by the minute as each day passed. She placed her hand on his just as Carl chose that unfortunate moment to step into the kitchen. He paused in his stride, his eyes trained on their hands, and his gaze narrowed. "Well, let's get to it. I haven't got all day," he snapped and strode out of the kitchen the same way he had entered. Winston patted her on the cheek and winked at her. Let's not rile him further. Naomi gave him a conspiratorial smile, and both of them rose and left together. The weather was mild as the sun peeked from behind the clouds that filled the sky, the feel of autumn in the air. They were approaching the stables when Carl led a horse out. "Please be patient with her," Winston begged, before turning to bestow an affectionate smile on her and going into the stables to saddle his own horse. "I don't know the meaning of the word," she heard him mutter, and trepidation rooted her to the spot. He eyed her. "Are you going to stand there all day beautifying yourself under the sun, or are we going to do this?" Blushing, she walked towards him and stood with her hands on her hips, staring at him sternly. "Get up on the horse," he ordered, and went to stand by the mare. He cupped his hands to help her up onto it. Naomi nervously approached the impatient-looking horse. It stomped its feet, and she wondered for a moment if it was going to attack her. The tip of her tongue came out to dash across her lips. Her hands became clammy and her eyes widened a little. "For God's sake, you're making her nervous," he snapped, dropping his hands and placing them on the horse's neck. "I'm making her nervous? She's the one making me jumpy. Why can't she stand still?" He rounded on her, and she could see the resentment in his eyes. "Don't you dare take that tone with her. She's sensing your fear, and it's making her edgy." Naomi's throat felt constricted as she swallowed thickly. Well, she couldn't help that she was a little frightened by the horse. The beast was massive, at least to her eyes. The animal was what horse lovers would probably call beautiful, with her glossy dark mane and smooth body. "Let's get started." He took his initial position, but Naomi just eyed him warily. She let out a nervous breath. "You can do this. You can." Was the call for riding lessons just a ploy to try your wiles on me again? I assure you, it won't work. Her head jerked at his harsh words, and she wondered for the umpteenth time what she had ever done to deserve his contempt. Anger came to her rescue. "Don't flatter yourself." "Then get on the horse," he thundered. The horse moved at his words, and she watched him calm her down before giving Naomi a quiet glare that propelled her forward. "Put your foot on the stirrup, swing your other leg to the opposite side, and make sure you're comfortable on the saddle," he instructed her impatiently. She nodded timidly and drew closer to stand beside him. She bit her bottom lip and wasn't sure how he would react if she asked for a pony. Her eyes darted inside the stables, and she had to stop herself from calling to Winston for help. She and Carl would be without him for weeks. She couldn't keep running to him for help. Elevating her chin, she gingerly placed her slipper on his open hands and then the stirrup. She tried swinging over the horse, but couldn't quite manage it. Her failure to do so had her looking ridiculous with one foot in the stirrup and the other leg halfway across the horse's back. As if her embarrassment wasn't enough, the horse moved fretfully, and when she tried to push her leg to the other side, the horse took it as a cue to move, and off it went. She screamed and heard Carl swear loudly. She managed to turn on the saddle and saw him running after them. "Get off the horse," he shouted at her. Was he crazy? Jump from a mad horse? Indeed, the man wanted her off his property anyway. even as a corpse. However, when she saw the horse heading towards the creek, she knew she had to heed his words. Not even thinking about it, she just moved her body and threw herself backwards. She braced herself to land on the hard ground, but was surprised when she fell on a hard yet soft surface. The breath was knocked out of her a little, but she would survive. "You'll be the death of me, I swear." The angry snarl behind her cleared her befuddled mind, and it dawned on her that she had fallen on him. Reddening like a beetroot with tears awash in her eyes, she quickly scrambled to her feet. She chanced a glance in his direction and saw him lying there with the breath knocked out of him. Not waiting for his caustic remarks, she lifted her skirts and ran as fast as her legs could take her. She didn't stop running until she reached her room and slammed the door. Tears coursed down her cheeks, and she frantically wiped them away with her hands as she thought of what to do. She couldn't stay there and have him tear into her with his words. Reaching for the doorknob, she yanked it open and ran out of the house again. She headed for the creek and hoped he wouldn't find her. She couldn't bear to hear his censorious words and his accusations. Oh, how terrible she felt. How silly he must think her. With all her supposed guts, she couldn't even ride a horse. What was she even doing on a ranch, hoping to get married when she was afraid of horses? She had to get out of here.
Scan the QR code or click on the link in the description to read the full book. The full audiobook will be available on YouTube in a few days. What did you like the most? Comment below and share this video on your social media and with your friends. Watch one of the following videos. Subscribe to our channel, like this video, and hit the notification bell to not miss any new audiobooks. Thank you for watching.